What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to the channel and to week 3 of my Overwatch League Stage 4 key matches, and I do apologize for being a day late on this video, but yesterday's video took me a really long time to make, and I just didn't have enough time to focus in on other content, so I hope you guys can forgive me for being a day late, but hey, better late than never, right? Anyway, last week yielded some very interesting results with a whole bunch of upsets too. Because of this, the league kind of feels like it's been flipped upside down, and at this point, we really don't know who's good, so it's hard to say which matches are going to be entertaining. This stage is making it far more difficult to decide which games hold the most entertainment value since we really don't know who's good anymore. So theoretically, I could say that every game's a key match, but that's no fun, and if I did that, this video would be way too long. So instead, I'm just going to try and highlight, as usual, which games stand out the most to me, even though it is a little bit harder than usual to do so. But before I get into the action, here's a quick overview of what the schedule is looking like this week, and also let me quickly explain how the series works for any of you who are new to it. So basically, what I do is pick out games that I recommend watching every single week of the regular season, and I usually give a brief explanation as to why I feel said game could be good, and give my score predictions as well. I also may highlight specific player matchups that I recommend keeping an eye on, and that's basically it. That's pretty much everything you need to know, so without wasting any more time, let's kick off my key matches starting with Thursday. I honestly think that Thursday could end up being the best day of the week just because there's a lot of interesting matches on paper, and because of this, I have 3 key matches for this day. The first of which is the London Spitfire versus Vancouver Titans, and I think it's safe to say that I have this for pretty obvious reasons. For one, Vancouver and London, at least in my opinion, are still being considered 2 of the better teams in the current meta, so it's going to be interesting to see who comes out on top in that regard because it could end up being a really evenly matched game. But then also, this is a rivalry game. Even though this is the first time these 2 teams have played each other in the Overwatch League, their rivalry stretches all the way back to Apex when it was GC Busan versus Runaway. So as you can imagine, this game is likely going to be very meaningful for all of the players who participated in their showdowns back in the day. One of the other reasons I find this game so intriguing is because both Vancouver and London are coming off of losses in which they got blown out by teams that are currently sitting at the bottom of the overall standings. Losses like these really have to hurt, and they could end up affecting your team's mentality, so because of that, this is definitely going to be seen as a bounce back game for both sides. Pay extra close attention to how these teams perform. Are they going to come out of the gate swinging as if nothing happened last week, or will they go off to a bit of a slow start because their mentality may have been affected by those bad losses? As for my prediction, I'm going to say that the Vancouver Titans take down the London Spitfire 3-2 in what should end up being a closely contested game, but I'm using the word should very loosely here just because this stage has been really unpredictable, so for all we know, this game could end up being a blowout. But either way, I see Vancouver coming out on top, blowout or not. It's not that I think London's a bad team, it's more that Vancouver overall this year has been the more consistent team. Plus, I feel that London is a very momentum-based team. I think that's pretty evident by the fact that they ended up going on this hot streak to win the grand finals, but overall, that's just the type of team they are, basically. Sometimes they go on these big streaks where they win a couple of games, and then they get really confident because of it, but then when they lose a game like they did against Florida, everything just seems to go really bad for these guys. Oh, and before I move on, pay extra close attention to Hureg versus Birdring in that Widowmaker 1v1. Hureg definitely has something to prove after London released him last year, so he wants to go out and basically say, hey, you made the wrong decision by getting rid of me and just replacing me with Birdring full time. But on the other hand, Birdring wants to prove that he is the one that deserves to be on the London Spitfire and that they made the correct choice. This is definitely a bragging rights game for both of them. Key matchup number 2 on Thursday will be between the Toronto Defiant and Florida Mayhem, and they're basically on here for the exact opposite reason of the London Spitfire and Vancouver Titans. Instead of being on the receiving end of an upset, they're the ones who pulled off a huge upset last week. And at the same time, both of them were really inconsistent last week since they both also lost a game. They pulled off a big upset, but then Florida got reverse swept. Then Toronto lost a really close game to the Philadelphia Fusion. I think it's going to be very interesting to see which team puts what they did wrong and right last week to better use, but then also, both of these teams on paper, at least in my opinion, appear to be pretty evenly matched overall. They're both near the bottom of the standings. They've been struggling for almost the entire year, but now they appear to be on the rise due to this new Stage 4 meta. Plus, just like with London versus Vancouver, we get the opportunity to watch a very epic battle between 2 godly hit-scan DPS players, that of course being Logix versus Saya player. And once again, this is kind of a bragging rights matchup since Logix did play on the Florida Mayhem last year. He's out to prove that Florida made a massive mistake by getting rid of him and switching to an all-Korean roster, either, but at the same time, Saya players out to show that he is by far the better hits game player and that he is going to try and dominate in every way possible in this Widowmaker battle. I recommend getting your popcorn ready for that one just because both Logix and Saya player have been on a tear all stage long, so what's going to happen when two unstoppable forces meet each other? It's going to be very fun to find out. Look out for the Gargoyle versus Gods matchup as well. Both of them have been absolutely killing it on the Roadhog and Diva as of late, so it's going to be a lot of fun to see who comes out on top in that individual matchup. But for my score prediction now, this is one of those 50-50 games for me where I think it's going to be very evenly matched and it's a situation where either team can win, but for the first time ever in this video series, I predict that the Florida Mayhem will win in a 3-2 victory. Don't get me wrong, Toronto looked really good last week too. They nearly beat the Fusion and they upset the Dragons, but at the same time, I feel that what Florida did is a little bit more impressive. Yes, getting reverse swept is nothing to be proud of, but the fact that they nearly took down the Washington Justice, who came off of a 4-0 victory against the Vancouver Titans just a couple of days later, really does show how much better this team has gotten. Plus, they did 3-0 the London Spitfire, so you have to give props to them there as well. Plus, I think that Florida's team is just slightly better right now. I would definitely take their tank line over Toronto's. No offense to Gods, of course, because I think he'll do just fine in a matchup against Gargoyle, but I feel that Sharik may come up short against somebody like Fate since he's the superior Orisa player. Okay, moving on to my final key matchup of Thursday night, I have the Seoul Dynasty taking on the Guangzhou Charge, and this is definitely a really big game for both sides since they're both in playoff contention right now. They want to make sure they can stay in that top 12 at the very least, and Seoul, they're in a position where they could end up sneaking into the top 6, so this game in a way is almost slightly more important for them, but it's definitely crucial for the Charge too, because if they lose this game and then their other game this week, then teams like the Valiant and the Fuel could sneak up on them. But also, as I mentioned earlier in this stage, since everybody is so high on the Charge right now, they need to prove to me that they can compete with some of the top tier teams in the league. The only teams they've beaten so far have been like bottom of the barrel squads that have been really struggling this stage, and the one time they did face a good opponent, they got crushed by the London Spitfire. So now here's another opportunity for them to prove themselves to me. If the Charge want me and other critics to really take them more seriously and say that they could definitely compete for a title, then they have to show that they can defeat some of these top tier opponents. They've got to do it. But it's more than just playoff implications and storylines that make this game very interesting. On paper, these teams appear to be pretty even. I would say that Seoul and Charge definitely have some advantages over each other. Like, I would say that Seoul's tank line is slightly better just because I'd take Marvel over Rio any day of the week, and Michelle's pretty comparable to Hoppa. But then a team like the Charge definitely have the better and more consistent DPS since Happy and Nero have been killing at this stage. And in my opinion, both Fleta and Fitz have been pretty hot and cold this stage, and the only player who's shown a little bit of consistency on their DPS core has been Illicit. Then of course, when comparing the support lines, I would say that they're pretty evenly matched. They both have a really good flex support, but then they both have a pretty mediocre main support at the same time. So it would seem that the Charge and the Dynasty kind of cancel each other out here since they both have an advantage and a disadvantage. Now for my score line. Well, part of me wants to go with the Charge here just because they've been the far more consistent team this stage, but at the same time, as I mentioned earlier, they have yet to prove themselves against a really good opponent, and on the other hand, even though Seoul, they've been kind of inconsistent, they've had their ups and downs, they've only faced good teams so far, and they even beat the Valiant, and they've taken a map off of the Shock and the Dragons as well, so because of that, I feel that the Seoul Dynasty will win this game 3-2 since the Charge are still unproven against really good opponents. Moving on to Friday, matchup number 1 that I recommend keeping an eye on is the San Francisco Shock versus the Shanghai Dragons, and I think this is a no-brainer one to tune in for since it is a rematch of the Stage 3 finals. But this game doesn't just hold entertainment value because the Shock may or may not get the revenge. It's also going to be interesting since this game is so loaded with DPS. I expect this to be very entertaining. You have the epic trio of Ding, Diem, and Youngjin going up against whatever the San Francisco Shock decide to play. They can go with Architect and Rascal, maybe they throw Sinatra and Striker in there as well. There's so many different lineup combinations the Shock could potentially run. Last week against the Gladiators, they decided to run Architect and Rascal, mostly because they can pretty much cover every hero in the game since they're so versatile. But then we saw Sinatra get thrown into the mix on Hanamura. Then of course, if Diem is dominating on Widow, they can always throw Striker in there. I just don't know what the Shock are going to do, and that really excites me. I'd say there's a good chance this game ends up being close, but I personally feel that it's going to be slightly less close than some people may imagine. I think that the Shock played a really solid game against the Gladiators last week, even though it went the distance to a map 5. Then the Dragons did struggle a little bit against the inconsistent Toronto Defiant, so if I had to take a guess, I'd say the Shock have a big time advantage. That's why I'm going to pick them to win this game 3-1. The other game I recommend keeping an eye on Friday is going to be the NYXL versus the Hangzhou Spark. To put it simply, Both of these teams have been struggling mightily to come up with wins, and also, they don't even look that competitive in their losses, which is a really bad sign. Both of these guys just appear to be in a really rough spot overall, because the NYXL's only win came against a very inconsistent Paris Eternal team. Then they also lost to the Hunters and Gladiators, who are now being considered better than them as of right now, it would seem. Then also, on the Spark side of things, they got destroyed in their games against the Reign and the Charge. They weren't close at all. Calling this a crucial bounce back game for both sides would be an understatement. Yes, the NYXL already have locked up the Atlantic division, but I'm sure they want to end this year off on a good note and gain some needed confidence back heading into the playoffs. Then on the Spark side of things, right now they're in a situation where if they keep losing, they will very well end up not in the top 6, and who knows, maybe they even fall out of the top 12 if things don't go in their favor. Even though this win would be good for the NYXL, the Spark need this. This is a must-win game for them. They have looked like an absolute mess so far this stage, and they just appear to have no confidence right now. A win for the Spark here could give them needed momentum and confidence that could propel them into a top 6 spot in the playoffs. But unfortunately for the Spark, I don't love their chances of taking down the NYXL. The only way they have a chance of winning this game is if the NYXL's DPS and supports have a really bad day yet again, just like they did against the Hunters, but I just don't see it happening. Historically, the NYXL have played really well against teams that are struggling, and they take advantage of them, and I'm willing to bet that history repeats itself here. That is why I am selecting the NYXL to win this game 3-1, and while I don't have any individual matchups for you guys to keep an eye on, I do recommend paying extra close attention to the NYXL DPS and support line because they've been really inconsistent as of late, like I said before, but then also just look at the Spark team as a whole. Do they look more confident in this game compared to others? That is the key that we have to look for with them. Because I'll tell you right now, if the Spark underperform yet again and get blown out, their momentum and confidence is going to plummet further and further downward to the point where they probably won't maintain a top 6 spot in the league. Heading into the weekend, I don't think the games are quite as good as the Thursday and Friday games. Because of that, on Saturday, I only have one key match for you guys, and it will be the LA Valiant taking on the Florida Mayhem. Earlier in the video, I discussed how Florida is a very interesting team to keep an eye on this week since they're coming off a big win against London, and they just look like a much improved team in general. Then the Valiant, on the other hand, they're still trying to keep their playoff hopes alive, obviously. They're currently in that 14th place spot. They're only a couple of wins behind the 12th place Chengdu Hunters, so obviously they're going to need one of those teams in the top 12 to suddenly choke and not do so well. Then also at the same time, they still need to get as many wins as they possibly can. If this was before Stage 4, I would say for sure that this is a nice, easy win for the Valiant, but at this point, who really knows? Florida looks like a completely different team, and with Fate being on there and knowing how to play against the Valiant a little bit since he was on the team for so long before, we could be in for a really good matchup, and because of that, I think it's going to go the distance to a map 5. If their matchup against Soon went to a map 5, then why not assume that their game against Fate also goes the distance? But my reasoning behind this prediction goes beyond a silly assumption like that. I also feel that Florida's DPS match up pretty well with the Valiant, especially when it comes to any sort of double sniper matchup. I feel that Sideplayer and BQB may actually be even more consistent than the likes of Agilities, Shax, and KSF. And believe it or not, I feel that Fate actually might be the better tank in this kind of meta compared to Fact Fiction, just because Fate's Ariza has looked a lot stronger than Facts has. Fact Fiction has been dying quite a bit for some reason, and Fate's been doing a better job of staying alive and executing a lot more of those Holt Hook combos with his partner in crime, Gargoyle. But regardless of who you think is better in the current meta, watching Fate versus Fact Fiction is going to be really important, because after all, the Valiant traded Fate to the Florida Mayhem in return for Fact Fiction, so this is a big time bragging rights matchup for both of them. Will the Valiant show that Fate is washed and that they don't need him anymore? Or is Fate going to make the Valiant miss him for the rest of their lives and make them regret making the trade to begin with? It's definitely a fun battle that you want to look out for, but as for my score prediction, I'm going to say that the Valiant take it in a really close 3-2 win. I really do think that Florida is going to make the Valiant have to earn this win. Florida and the Valiant have been trending in different directions. Florida's been looking a lot better since the beginning of Stage 4. Meanwhile, the Valiant have gone through some tough games. They lost a tough map 5 to Seoul, they almost lost to Paris, then Dallas actually made them struggle for about one half of their game against them. But in the end, I think the Valiant end up coming out on top just because they've got a bit more motivation right now. I think their sheer determination to try and make the top 12 is going to push them to greater heights than the Florida Mayhem can keep up with. Okay, coming into Sunday, game number 1 that I recommend watching is the Washington Justice versus Houston Outlaws. As I mentioned earlier in the video, the Vancouver Titans got upset because the Washington Justice destroyed them in a 4-0 victory, and I'm interested to see how they do in their first game coming off of that victory against a decent team. They do play the Uprising earlier in the week, but the Uprising look like arguably the worst team in the league right now, and the Outlaws are at least a somewhat competent team. The Washington Justice may be the most fun team to watch in the league right now, then also the Outlaws are pretty unpredictable. You never know if they're going to show up or not. One day they'll lose to Paris, but then the next they'll destroy the Gladiator. So who knows what the Outlaws do against a team like the Justice, who are looking like one of the top teams in the league. Plus, the DPS matchups are a big time headline heading into this one. You've got potential Linkser versus Corey battles on Widowmaker, or maybe Corey takes on Jake in the Hanzo department, or perhaps we see some Stratus versus Jake Farah action. And who knows what happens with Dante? Maybe his Sombra could be the key to success against the Justice. Even though I don't think this game is going to end up being all that close just because the Justice look like a really confident team that's just having fun on stage right now, I really do think this game's going to be a lot of fun to watch because of those DPS players. I'm expecting a lot of crazy highlights from this one. The Justice do look like the superior team, so I'm selecting them to win this game 3-1. And lastly, the final game that I recommend watching this week will be the NYXL taking on the Guangzhou Charge. And I kind of already talked about both of these teams already, so I'll just go into light details by saying that, again, the Charge are trying to prove themselves against top tier competition while also maintaining a spot in the top 12 in the league standings. Meanwhile, the NYXL are just trying to get back on track and look like a more confident and competent team in the current meta. Plus, there's a whole bunch of really good individual matchups to look out for. Obviously, there's the whole DPS thing. You have Happy and Nero taking on the crazy amounts of talented players that the NYXL possess at that position. But then, in my opinion, probably the most interesting duel to look out for is Shu versus Jonek, just because they're two of the better flex support players in the world, kind of like with the whole Jaehong and Shu thing. And I honestly think this game comes down to whoever plays better. Will Shu be the one to make the bigger plays on the Ana and Zenyatta, or will Jonek prevail? And I know I may sound like a hypocrite here or something like that, but even though the Charge are taking on yet another team that is really good, I think they have the advantage in this one, unlike their game against Seoul, since the NYXL have pretty much nothing to play for at this point since they've already wrapped up the Atlantic division. Meanwhile, the Charge really can't afford to lose any games right now in fear that someone behind them ends up taking their spot in the top 12. Also, the Charge DPS just appear to be a lot more comfortable in the current meta. Whether the NYXL play Nene, Flower, or say Biobi, for some reason they just don't look all that good. Then on the other hand, both Shu and Happy have been dominating, whether it's on Mei Reaper, Double Sniper, you name the composition, they've been doing really great. One other negative aspect that I've noticed about the NYXL overall at this time is that they tend to not play all that well against teams that catch them off guard. I don't know what it is, but if a team beats them pretty bad in the first map, they have a really hard time recovering. Whenever a team surprises the NYXL or they outplay them on a specific map, it really affects their mindset, and they just forget how to play that same style of Overwatch that's found them so much success over the years. And I'm getting the feeling that the NYXL are going to struggle with a lot of these same things in their match against the Charge this weekend. Even though the Charge haven't looked that good against top tier opponents, I feel that so long as they're able to have a pretty good performance in that first map, the NYXL will likely crumble. And that's what I'm predicting to happen. I think the Charge are going to end up winning control, and the NYXL will be mentally boomed for the rest of the series because of it, and as a result, Happy and Nero are going to show their brilliance in the current meta and that they have a better understanding of it compared to the NYXL DPS, and then Shu is going to more than hold his own against Jonek. So my final score for this game will be the Guangzhou Charge, taking it 3-1. And with that being said, that is going to wrap up another installment of my key match series. What matches are you looking forward to watching the most this week? Make sure to let me know down in the comments section. And if you enjoyed this content, then I would appreciate it if you could like and subscribe. You can also follow me on Twitter at ATP Overwatch and join my Discord through the link in the description. As always, thank you all so much for watching today's video, and until next time, this is ATP, signing out. Peace.